So, greetings, friends. Today's talk is on the thicket of views that have developed in modern Buddhism and have been developing ever since the Buddha's teaching career. The Buddha awakened to the profound understanding that it is ignorance, specific ignorance, ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing disappointing and unsatisfactory experiences, in the word dukkha. What he understood about ignorance is the sole reason why he developed an Eightfold Path as the only path he ever taught towards awakening. And it's the Eightfold Path that provides the framework for a mind that is otherwise rooted in ignorance and prone to confusion and deluded thinking that results in ongoing suffering. That is the primary problem. A mind rooted in ignorance will develop very subtle but very powerful strategies to continue to ignore its own ignorance. That's the nature of ignorance. And a self-referential ego self, that which the Buddha identified or classified as anatta, not a self, clings to these views that continue to establish itself in every thought, word, and idea that occurs. So the problem of continued eye-making is really the central theme of the Buddha's teachings. And the insight gained as far as what the Buddha taught is into the wrong views resulting in continued suffering. And it is those wrong views that seek to establish a permanent self in an environment of constant impermanence. In other words, it's an impossible task and a foolish task to try to continue to establish a self in an impermanent realm. A complete understanding of what the Buddha taught shows that what we see as a self is always in a constant process of becoming. It does not mean that there is no such thing as a self. That's another strategy to establish a self in a realm of emptiness or nothingness, which in itself is very confusing, but that's what one of the largest schools of Mahayana Buddhism attempts to do. The Buddha simply taught that the views that we're currently holding of a self are wrong views. Let go of it. Let go of those views. That's what anatta means. The three marks of existence of anicca, impermanence, anatta, the not self characteristic, and the resulting suffering that comes from the interaction of those first two is what the Buddha taught to gain insight into. And again, a very specific insight into the three marks of existence through developing the Eightfold Path. I want to read some words from the Kalama Sutra that are so telling here. The Kalama Sutra is one of the suttas that is wildly misinterpreted, especially by modern teachers, to justify changing and altering or dismissing the Buddha's teachings to fit one's views. When the Buddha taught the Kalama Sutra to a group, the Kalamas, who were at the time confused by all the different spiritual teachers that kept coming through them. The Kalamas lived on a trade route, so there was all the spiritual teachers of that time traveled through there and tried to influence the Kalamas, and the Kalamas came to the Buddha and says, every one of you that comes through here claims to have the one true Dharma. How do we know? How can we tell? And the Buddha said, do not go by reports or legends or traditions or scripture, meaning that whatever has been used to establish the Dharma is not enough. Just because it's accepted and established is not enough to develop as a path to awakening. You have to integrate it and have your own experience of it. The Buddha continues, don't go by conjecture or inference or analogies. And this last one, or common agreement, meaning just because there may be thousands and thousands, or today even millions of people, is no reason to give something validity as far as what the Buddha taught. And that's not to diminish all the many religions that have, many Buddhist religions that have developed. That's an understandable thing. Over 2,600 years since the Buddha's passing, the religions that have grown up are simply understandable because that's what people do. They try to create something that would justify their own ignorance and create entire structures around them. Do not go by common agreement or unexamined loyalty, meaning no matter how much favor you may hold your teacher or your tradition in, you should certainly have the wherewithal to examine what you're following. After all, your awakening depends on it. The Buddha continues, when you know from your own experience that the qualities taught are unskillful, shameful, confusing, that's an important point, confusing or distracting, these teachings should be abandoned. I spent many, many years in modern Mahayana Buddhism getting more and more confused, not moving towards enlightenment, and more distracted from the fact that I was becoming more and more confused. And I won't name the exact traditions, but they were rooted in the Tibetan traditions and the Zen traditions. And again, if you're listening to this and you're finding understanding and a deepening and peaceful mind, and you seem like you're moving towards something that is achievable, that's fine. But if you were like me and you felt like you were getting more and more confused, more and more distracted, and having to take more and more on faith, then that's not something the Buddha taught. That line here, if it's shameful or confusing, the Buddha was an awakened human being, and so he could not possibly have taught something that would lead to more confusion. That would be cruel, wouldn't it? The Buddha taught a simple and direct path towards awakening. He continues, when these teachings are criticized by the wise, they should be abandoned. And the wise doesn't mean someone that we might think is wise. Someone that is well grounded in the Buddha's teachings themselves are the only ones that can accurately describe what the path is. If you don't understand something, if you've never studied what the Buddha actually taught, how can you possibly teach it? And that's the problem with most of modern Buddhism, is even before, how do I say this correctly? If you don't study the Buddha's teachings, how could you possibly teach what the Buddha taught, or how could you possibly even know or infer what it is? You have to study the suttas in order to study what the Buddha taught. If you study something that charismatic individuals have taught, and some of the most hurtful people in our lifetime have established themselves simply based on their charisma, and these are teachers that had developed no way of practicing restraint. And we all have heard the unfortunate stories of drunken and drug addicted and sex crazed teachers that preyed on their students, all proclaiming that they were teaching the Buddha's Dhamma. How disrespectful could anyone possibly be? And then what is really most disturbing to me is how the students have been taken in so deeply that they will continue to defend these teachers by saying, some of the time the excuse is given that they're so advanced that they're beyond even human decency. That's just ridiculous. But that's what happens when we substitute anything for what the Buddha taught. Let me continue. When these teachings lead to harm and suffering, they should be abandoned. When it's obvious that they're not developing a calm and peaceful mind, a mind that is rooted in wisdom and compassion, not hurtfulness and competitiveness. And in some case, and I'm not saying this doesn't happen to every deluded teacher, but very predatory practices in some instances. Of course, we should recognize that this is a false Dhamma, and we can't excuse the teacher without recognizing that their Dhamma is a false Dhamma. The Buddha says, now don't go by reports, legends, traditions, scripture, or conjecture, meaning we don't create assumptions over what the Buddha, over what this Dhamma should be. Assumptions are what are rooted in ignorance. Just got a flicker on a screen. I hope I didn't lose anyone there. Do not go by inference or analogies or common agreement or unexamined loyalty. If you're going to follow someone, especially as something as important as Dhamma practice, you should, and those teachers should be encouraged to examine what they're teaching. When you know from your own experience that the qualities taught are skillful, shameless, unambiguous, another important line, unambiguous, it's clear and easy to understand. And direct, these teachings are direct. These teachings should now be developed. When these teachings are praised by the wise, they should be developed. When these teachings lead to unbinding and calm, that's the whole point of the Buddha's teaching, is to develop release from clinging and a calm and peaceful mind. That release from clinging is clinging to wrong views. And so anything that would continue to develop wrong views and continue to distract is obviously something that is hurtful and should be recognized. The Buddha continues, what do you think, Kalamas, when the defilements do not arise in a person, is this for their long-term welfare and happiness, and for others' long-term welfare and happiness? And of course, the response was, for everyone's long-term welfare and happiness. And this person, free of defilement, does not kill living beings or take what is not given or take another spouse. Interesting in relation to some of the things that have happened with modern teachers. Or lie, or induce others to lie. So what do you think? Are these qualities skillful, shameless, and praised by the wise? They are, sir. When developed and acted on, they bring long-term welfare and happiness to oneself and others. Now, Kalamas, one who follows the Dhamma, who develops the Eightfold Path. Buddha's being very clear here about what the path is, the Eightfold Path. Free of greed, aversion, or deluded thinking, alert and mindful of the path, experiences their life imbued with goodwill. Everywhere they go, their mindfulness is imbued with goodwill, with gratitude, with a mind resting in equanimity. They are abundant and free from all agitation towards themselves and all humanity. There's more to the Kalama Sutra, and there's more in this article that I've cited. But the true test of the Buddha's Dhamma is, does it bring peace and calm? Does it lead to unbinding? And if it doesn't seem that, after a reasonable amount of engagement with that Dhamma, it should be abandoned. Again, after all, our awakening, and in the true sense, our minds depend on a true and useful Dhamma. Now, in reading the suttas, there's nothing in the Buddha that the Buddha ever taught that is outside of the Four Noble Truths and outside of the Eightfold Path as developing awakening. And yet, in many of the modern Buddhist schools that are rooted in a thicket of views, there's an almost endless series of rituals and practices that are presented as having the primary importance of their teaching. And there is very little reference to the Four Noble Truths in developing the Eightfold Path, and certainly hardly any instruction on how to develop the Eightfold Path and how to become awakened. And another one of the benchmarks of the confusion and deluded thinking prevalent in modern Buddhism is the adaptation or dismissal of dependent origination, and lending that or teaching that as some type of creation myth, when in fact the dependent origination is what the Buddha awakened to, and it clearly shows how delusion occurs. And the Buddha's very first teaching then was on the Four Noble Truths, to teach the result of a life rooted in ignorance. And any substitution that follows from that is always going to lead to more confusion and deluded thinking. One of the things that I often hear from students, and I've heard it from even some friends, that some of the practices that the later developed schools use are there to help with keeping a mind focused and inclined towards the Dhamma. And what I'm talking about now is chanting or physical rituals, such as prostrations, and that doing a series of prostrations helps quiet the mind. Well, all of that might be true, except every one of those schools that develop these extra teachings that the Buddha taught, these embellishments to the Dhamma, never teach the Eightfold Path as the Buddha taught, to develop awakening. So even if an external practice such as repetitive prostrations or repetitive chanting helps to focus the mind in the moment, that focused mind is useless without the framework of the Eightfold Path to develop. And again, that's the problem with that, is those are taught as and used as substitutes to what the Buddha taught. And I'm naming just a few, but that list is endless as things that have become substitutions for the Buddhist teachings and have led to this modern thicket of views. That phrase, the thicket of views, again, is something that the Buddha used to describe the common so-called spiritual practices of his time, and that led to much confusion to the folks that eventually found themselves with the Buddhist teaching. And one of the things that I found that of my own students that had the biggest difficulty in developing what the Buddha taught are those that had already developed a strong conditioned view of what Buddhism should be, or what it looks like, or what it experiences. The clearest direction that I can give is to develop the Dhamma as the Buddha taught, that after all, this is an awakened human being, and to avoid anything that was developed after, if you're truly interested in developing what a Buddha taught. After all, if I want to learn something from, if I want to learn a teaching that is based on what an individual taught, common sense would tell me that I want to seek out the teacher, the original teacher. And that is still possible today. Another one of the things that is probably the greatest myth that modern Buddhism teaches is that we can't know what the Buddha taught because there's no accurate record. Well, there is. And I won't. Today's talk is not on the authenticity of the Pali Canon. Although there's an article on my website, and I'll give a talk about that at some point in the future here. I give that talk often at my center in Frenchtown. The way that the Sutta Pitaka was preserved is remarkable. And again, I won't get into that here. But what's most important and what's most apparent when you read the suttas, excuse me, is the consistency of the Buddhist teaching and how everything that he taught, when you understand when you understand dependent origination and the Four Noble Truths, then you understand the context for everything else that the Buddha would teach in his 45-year teaching career. And understanding that and weighing things, weighing other suttas or framing other suttas within that proper context gives clear direction on the Buddha's path to awakening, the Eightfold Path. And it helps avoid the modern thicket of views. So again, I guess the most important thing that I can say in this talk is if you want to follow what an awakened human being taught, it's easy to do, it's accessible, and that is to study the Sutta Pitakas as preserved in the Pali Canon. And my teachings and my book, Becoming Buddha, Becoming Awakened, is written for that purpose, to show the framework and present enough of the suttas in the proper context to develop wholeheartedly and develop awakening in this lifetime and fairly quickly. You know, another great myth is that it takes, and I don't even know why I followed this for many years, but I was told, well, it takes endless eons to develop awakening. And that was so disheartening, but I did it anyway because people said it so often that I figured, well, it must be true, but everybody else is doing it, so I might as well follow. Well, that was my association. So it's also important, if you want to avoid the thicket of views in modern Buddhism, to not associate with those that are developing that, and associate yourself with what the Buddha actually taught. So I hope you found this talk helpful today. And again, let me just qualify it as I'm not trying to put down, I know it sounds like that, I'm not trying to put down any other religion, including modern Buddhist religions, but it's important to be clear about what the Buddha taught and to keep the Dhamma well focused on what the Buddha taught. And that can be done. That can be accomplished easily. So again, I hope you found some benefit from this talk. If you did, please consider a donation at becoming-buddha.com. And thank you for joining, and thank you for watching. Peace.